So we're continuing, Unit 34, the Morenu Shiur, units that discuss kavod, ועונג, Shabbat. Specifically, the one we're up to has to do with kinyan and commerce, right? Ownership, changes, and commerce, right? I'd say buying, but buying doesn't quite encompass what we're talking about, which we're going to see specifically in the Ran that we're going to learn in a moment. So as soon as I could work out how to do this exactly the way I want it. Okay, so here's a Tosefta. The Tosefta says the following thing about when Yantiv comes out of Shabbos. That's not what happens this year with Pesach, right? What happens this year with Pesach is that we have Shabbos and then Yantiv. So you can't cook on Shabbos for Yantiv because you can't cook on Shabbos. But when Yantiv comes out, but that's okay because you can cook on Yantiv. So you cook before Shabbos for Shabbos and then you cook on Yantiv for Yantiv. So that's good. But what happens when Shabbos comes out Motzei Yantiv? And if you don't have a fridge and you don't have a freezer and you don't have ways of keeping food you cook on Wednesday good and fresh for Shabbos, or fresh enough for Shabbos, what do? So we have a Ruv of Shilin. What about if someone does not have a Ruv of Shilin? So most of us, we all say in our own nusach, when we say Ruv of Shilin, we say that we're setting aside the Ruv of Shilin to motzi everyone in the city. So generally speaking, it's not really a problem. But when there isn't that nusach, when you make a mistake and the person did not do the Ruv of Shilin, is not somech on the city's Ruv of Shilin, what does he do? But he needs to eat on Shabbos. He doesn't have a fridge, doesn't have ways of getting good food. So the Braita says, you're not to do anything on Yontiv for Shabbos. You might argue someone else did an Eruv of Shilin, so now I'm cooking for him. So, sorry, that doesn't work either. People are also not allowed to cook for him. So here's what you do. You give the raw ingredients to someone else, and they'll cook for you. Question: could you give the raw ingredients to someone else on Shabbos and Yantiv? Yantiv we're talking about right now, right? You give the raw ingredients to someone else on Yantiv. So presumably you'd say, Lich'ora, we saw earlier that you can give things to people on Yantiv if they can use it, if it's useful, right? So maybe you can. All right. Says the Ran, interesting point here. Laknuye bilshon matana belo sudar. Aval ela kisha metaltelin yiknu mshicha. If you need to give the flour, you need to give whatever raw ingredient that you want made for Shabbos, Yantiv. You're allowed to cook for Yantiv. You're not to cook for Shabbos. You want to make for you for Shabbos. You can give it to someone else as a present, but do it in a way that's not a proper kinyan. Now there are two very opposite ways of learning this Ran. Or let me ask you guys, is this Ran a kula or a chumrah? What do you think? What's your impression? Is the Ran being mekel or being machmir? So I see Yonathan's agreeing it's a good question.
I wouldn't say he's mekel so much, because I think he's saying that the kinyan that you would do on Yom Tov is like metaltelin. It's not full kinyan. Laknuye belo sudar.
You're not to do it in a way that's, I'd say, explicit commerce. In other words, you can do it as a like a low-key kinyan, but you can't do it as a business transaction, right? Right? Is that a fair differentiation? Right? So what I mean to say is there are two ways of reading the Ran. One way is to say, look, in this case, I'm allowed to give things to my neighbor, cook for me, I'm allowed. So in all cases in which I'm allowed to give something to someone else, it has to be done without a sudar. This would include, just for argument's sake, when we said, okay, that's like so far, good, this Shulchan Aruch. Etc., right? All these things. You're allowed to give someone on Yontiv. You're allowed to do business transaction, that is to act it out as the way it's done in business. The answer based on this round would be no. All the things you're allowed to give others as presents on Shabbos and Yontiv, you're allowed to do that, except you're not allowed to do it with a sudar, right? You're not allowed to do it at the proper high level, high key opinion. That's one way of reading the Ran. But then you can read the Ran the exact opposite. The Ran could be saying like this. Let's go back to this Braita. What's the justification of giving someone else these presents? It's not really a present, is it? I'm kind of giving me a present, right? I forgot to do Erev Tavshilin, so I go to my neighbors, the Ben Davids, and I say, could you bake challahs for me for Shabbos? And they say, well, we can't. We're not allowed. So I say, okay, here's a kilo of flour. Why don't you bake yourselves a kilo? Why don't you bake yourselves some challah? And they bake it for themselves, and then they give it to me, right? That's what's going on here. What's the justification of giving it to them? Of my giving them the present? Could I argue I'm giving them a present for Yontiv? It's first of all, I'm not giving them a present, and second, I'm not giving the present for Yontiv. I'm giving this present on Yontiv, but not for Yontiv, because I'm explicitly saying. I'm implicitly saying. I'm not saying explicitly, otherwise that would be a problem. But implying, and what we really understand, that what I'm asking for is that they bake it for Shabbos and for me, right? So it's not for them, for Yontiv, it's for Shabbos, for me, right? And then says the Ran, in cases in which we have this specific kind of heter, then you do it without a sudar. Now, is that a chumrah or a kula? Then you do it without a sudar, then you do it just like, oh, here's a bag of flour. Okay. Low level, low key kinyan. Now, is that a kula or a chumrah? So it sounds like I'm saying that's a chumrah, right? Because you'd think, yeah, you could. This is like anything else, right? But really, it ends up being a big kula. Why is it end up being a big kula? Because what I'm saying is the following. Really, it's very hard to justify doing this kinyan here. It's very hard to justify giving this present. So why do we allow it? Says the Ran, well, do it without a sudar. That means I can give any present on Yontiv as long as I don't use a sudar. Right? So, again, it's a bit confusing, but the way in the Ran that sounds more like a kula ends up being more of a chumrah, and vice versa. Okay? The Ran says, if you say that this case is a regular case, I can give presents on Yontiv, I can give, right? We saw the Shulchan Aruch here, right? Shmanim, slatot, all the stuff, fine, right? So same too, I can take a bag of flour and give it to my next door neighbor. Says the Ran, yeah, you can, but whenever you do that, just make sure not to use a serious business transaction. So we're very mekel when it comes to the criteria of what am I allowed to give, but we're very machmir that you're never allowed to use a kinyan sudar. That's one way of reading the Ran. The opposite way of reading the Ran is saying this case really does not justify. We're more machmir when it comes to the criteria of what are you allowed to give it as a present. But we end up with a very big kula. If you ever want to give any present on Yontiv, even if there's no real justification, because as I said, it's not really for you, it's not really for Yontiv, right? Or maybe I'd say, it's not really for Yontiv, but it's not even a present in the proper sense, right? I'm giving myself a present more than I'm giving you a present, right? Whenever you have that case, so let's say I want to give someone a bar mitzvah present on Shabbos. If I want to read the Ran the second way, all I need to do is just give him the present, and not do kinyan sudar, and we're good. That's a very big kula, right? So those are two ways of reading the Ran. Let's see what the Rishonim and Poskim did with this. Mordechai says, "Maknekim chol acherim, uv'hai gavna etiru laknot b'yom tov mishum mitzvah." So, is this a normal criteria of heter to give presents on Shabbos and Yontiv? It seems that it's not, right? It's a specific heter because of the mitzvah. Meaning, I'm not going to have challahs on Shabbos, so I'm going to allow you to give the neighbor a present. As I said before, why do I need a special heter? Why don't I just say, the Shulchan Aruch we saw earlier? Shulchan Aruch said, you can give shmanim, slatot, whatever. Why is this any different? I think the answer is not giving the present for Yontiv. I'm not giving you a present, I'm giving myself a present. And therefore, right, for that reason, the Mordechai says, when you do that, you can do it mishum mitzvah, so it's a special heter. And so when you do for the sake of a mitzvah, then you're allowed to do a kinyan. So we can read the Mordechai in one of two ways. We can say the Mordechai and the Ran, or maybe the way the Mordechai would interact with the Ran, one of two options. One is to say, this is a special heter mishum mitzvah. It's not for Yantiv, it's not for you, for me. So it's a special heter mishum mitzvah. And in that case, the Ran says, then you have to do bilshon matana belo sudal. But normally, if I just want to give a present on Yantiv because I'm allowed to give presents on Yantiv, then I can also use a kinyan sudal. That would be the implication. When you have a special heter mishum mitzvah, then you have to. It's a special heter, so don't use a sudal. That's one way of reading it. The other way of reading it is to say the Ran. These are two separate solutions. What justifies giving the present on Yantiv here? It's not for Yantiv and it's not even for you. What's the justification? So the Mordechai says the justification is mitzvah. The Ran says, no, this isn't real mitzvah. Etrog love is a real mitzvah, but to eat on Shabbos is a mitzvah, but tzeder. I mean, if you didn't cook before Shabbos, so you don't have food on Shabbos. Tough, right? Figure it out. Work it out. That really doesn't justify giving the mitzvah on giving the present on Yantiv. What would justify is giving it, just handing it over below kiyan sudal, without a low-key, low-level kinyan, right? Now, that would be presumably, once again, it sounds like the Ran is more machmir, because the Mordechai says, come on, it's for Shabbos. It's a mitzvah. The Ran says, this isn't a real mitzvah. But the Ran would end up saying, as I said before, for a much bigger kula. It means that whenever there's no justification in giving the present, you can always use a low-key, low-level kinyan. Right, those are the two ways of that the Ran and the Mordechai will interact here. Med Yosef says, I have no idea what's going on here. So if you guys are confused, you're in good company. Med Yosef. If I'm just handing over the bag of flour to my neighbor, so why are you saying it's mishum mitzvah? What's the Beit Yosef assuming? It sounds like he's saying the Ran solved all the problems. Whenever you need to do kinyan on Shabbos, just hand it over. Just don't do any high level, right? Explicit kinyanim. Just hand it over. You want to give a bar mitzvah boy present on Shabbos? No problem. Just give him the sefer. Give him whatever you're giving him, right? Whatever it is, right? Give him the vase you bought him. Whatever it is, you're giving the bar mitzvah boy, the chatan kala, whatever it is. Give it on Shabbos. Just don't do kiyan sudar. And then the Beit Yosef says, I don't understand. Why does the Mordechai have to start saying mishum mitzvah? Why do you need to have special heter mishum mitzvah? Just give it over. Just don't do kiyan sudar. Which means he learned the Ran in the extreme heter way that says, anytime there's no justification, just give it, just hand it over without being too explicit about the kinyan you're doing. And that, as I said, is a very, very big kula. The problem is that the Beit Yosef is not sure if this works. He continues and says, if Shada afilu laknot b'mishicha b'lo kinyan sudar, sover Mordechai da'asur mishum demichze k'mekach u'memkar v'mkom mitzvah hetiru. So it could be that the Mordechai disagrees with that. Now, disagrees with what? Does this mean that that's not what the Ran meant, or it means that the Mordechai doesn't agree with that? Right? It sounds more like the Beit Yosef says the Ran definitely said that whenever you need to give a present on Shabbos or Yantiv, and there's no justification of doing so, just hand it over. Just don't do a high-level kinyan. The Mordechai disagrees, and that's why he has to say, well, here's a special heter mishum mitzvah. But it definitely sounds in the way the Beit Yosef is discussing it that he accepted the Ran at face value and said, there's no justification to giving the present here, so just give it over without a kinyan. And therefore, in any case in which there's no justification, you can always give it over without a kinyan. The Mordechai says, nah, that doesn't come on. You ruined the whole Isur won't exist if you do that, right? As he says at the end here. Look like Mekach Memkar. So that's why you need a special heter mishum mitzvah in this case. So as I said, the Mordechai's criteria of what you define as mitzvah, it's a lower bar. On the other hand, his need of that bar, his need of lowering the bar, is because he disagrees fundamentally with the Ran and says, you can't just give presents on Shabbos because you didn't do a Ma'aseh Kinyan. So that's the way the Beit Yosef learned the Machloket. Have a look at the Meiri. אם הקנה קמחו במתנה לאחר שעירב אותו המערב, יכול להפותה ולשולחה לו. Right, the neighbor did the Eruv Tavshil and you didn't. So you give him the bag of flour so he can bake your chalos for you for Shabbos, right, on Yontiv for Shabbos. כמו שאפשר לו לאכילות שלו, ואפילו בשלו לעצמן, מבשלים הקדוש ומבשלים לאורחים. ואין לחוש להקנה כזו ביום טוב, שהרי מתנה מיד ליד היא שלא כדרך קניין. Sounds very much like the Ran, right? You might say, this isn't real. Well, how do you justify this kinyan? This isn't justifiable kinyan. It's not for Yantiv, and it's not for your neighbor. It's for you. What's the justification? He says, nah, because you just give it to him. It's not a kinyan.
So this sounds pretty clearly like he doesn't require like makom mitzvah.
Right.
Sounds like he's saying
exactly like the Ran Lekula, like the Ran the way the Beit Yosef learned the Ran. Right.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to point out an interesting point. It is matana miyad liyad, meaning as long as there's a bit of a catch-22 here. You can say, well, maybe I just didn't do a kinyan. He just has my flour and baking that flour, right? My flour. Wrong. You can't, because as we said in the Braita, he isn't allowed to cook my things. He's only allowed to cook his own things. So there has to be a kinyan, but it has to be a low-level kinyan, right? It has to be a kinyan, but not one that's too, no, I'm not even trying to define it, but right, not too business-like, as it were, not too, right?
Can I suggest a svara
Sure.
that has to do with the business-like element?
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's not just that like it's more business-like than giving something, but I think it might also have everything to do with what we're trying to accomplish when we are matir presence and Yom Tov. We are doing something that's letzorech hayom, which means that the thing that we're giving needs to be here in front of us. And kinyan sudar is good when you're trying to do a kinyan on something that's not right here in front of us. So a kinyan meshicha feels more appropriate for the kinds of situations that are actually allowed.
Yefeh, that's a nice svara. Yefeh. Very good. In other words, what Yaakov's saying is it's not just a matter of, well, we're ushering business like that. The point is, we are, as we said last year, we're pro-giving presents on Yantiv. We just need them to be for Yantiv. So Yaakov says, how do you define that? Well, there are a whole bunch of definitions, but maybe one of them is having it in front of you. And therefore, anything that would require some kind of outer Ma'aseh Kinyan that's not done with the actual item must be asur. And then you can argue, how far do we matir just handing things over to each other? Yefeh, it's a nice svara.
Right. I would say that if you explain it that way, it's like a prerequisite. It's not necessarily enough. In other words, I could understand reading the Ran,
right,
the more machmir way, and say that's just a low bar because otherwise it's for sure out. But then you still need to justify it in some other way.
Right. So as we said, I just want to show the two ways we have of reading the Ran right now, right? The Meiri reads the Ran again. The Meiri reads the Ran. I don't know if the Meiri read the Ran, but the way the Meiri, if we want to say that the two ways of understanding what the Ran is saying, one way is the way we're reading the Ran, and seems to be in the Beit Yosef, that anytime you hand something over to someone else just like that, that's never an issue on Shabbos or Yantiv. There's no issue with that kind of kinyan. That seems to be the Beit Yosef and the Meiri. The way we want to say the Mordechai and the Ran work together, That's the other option, to say, first of all, it has to be the Shem Mitzvah, and even after we say it's the Shem Mitzvah, it's really, there's no justification doing this kinyan, then we can say either two options of how to justify, either by saying, well, there is justification to mitzvah, or saying, this isn't a real mitzvah, not in the classic sense of like a tribula, right, or bad minim. So just hand it over to him, and that would end up being with the Beit Yosef and the Meiri. It's one way of reading the Ran. The other way to say the Ran, the Mordechai agree, and to say the first stage is to say it's a mitzvah, so it's a special heter. Special heter, so you have to do it in a special way, right? It's two ways of reading the Ran.
The point about it being a mitzvah, and he says it about lulav, because lulav you have to actually own it. So he can't, the Mordechai can't say like the Meiri, it's not really kinyan, it's just miyad liyad. He wouldn't, the Meiri wouldn't never bring the example of lulav to say, well, you can also do lulav this way, I think.
Right, but I just want, that's why exactly for that point, after I read the Meiri, I went back to the Braita and reminded us, there must be a kinyan. As long as it's actually owned by someone else, you have a problem. That's right. The neighbor can't use his own flour.
You can't even give it over.
Would use it. Sorry, the neighbor.
You can't really give it over to the neighbor because that's also not allowed. So it's like some kind of middle way.
Kind of a midway kinyan. A midway kinyan. So, have a look at the Or Zarua who agrees with the Mordechai. That's interesting because what do you mean Simchat Yom Tov? It's really for Shabbos, right? It means so I could sleep on Yom Tov, right? Otherwise I'd be all upset that I won't have anything to eat tomorrow. So the heter, again, it's the same idea. How do you justify saying that this is for Yom Tov? It's for Shabbos, it's not for Yom Tov, right? The answer is, well, what kind of calm, happy Yom Tov am I going to have if I'm all upset about what am I going to eat tomorrow, right? That would be the idea there. See the Bach, same idea, presumably. Knyazo hi belo kinyan sudal, ela bilshon matana greido vimshicha. Af agav demir zekuvd in dechol mishum mitzvah etiru laknoto. So how does the Bach read this? He says both, right? First he says this siman taf kuf kaf zayin, right? The hilchot Yom Tov. Knya zoi belo kinyan sudal, like the Ran. Why is it allowed? Meaning, even after I say you don't do kinyan sudal, I still ask, why is it allowed? And then the answer is mishum mitzvah etiru. So the Bach reads the second way, right? I don't remember the first and the second, but the point is he interposes the Mordechai and the Ran on each other. Right? He says, first of all, you need justification of the mitzvah, and even after that justification, still do it below kinyan sudal. Right? Similar to the Magen Avraham. Magen Avraham in Taf Kuf Kaf Zayin refers us back to Siman Shin Vav. Siman Shin Vav, he says, I just want to show that I'm not pulling this out of a different seif, right? To show that the Magen Avraham himself says these go together. He says already intent kimcho b'meshicha bli kinyan sudal, like the Ram. He says if you want to understand this ad hasof, read Siman Shin Vav. Siman Shin Vav, he writes, Hamordechai sover da'asur liten davar b'matan hachavor b'yom tov v'shabbat elem ken tzorich mitzvah, ופשוט לצורך שבת שרי, לכן משמע בעירובין, דמקנה רשות בשבת אסור אפילו בלא kinyan sudal. So the Magen Avraham, just like the Bach, Davka connects the two, right? In other words, maybe I'd say like the second option, the Beit Yosef, right? I want to just remind us. The Beit Yosef starts off with saying, we have the Ran. The Ran made life easy. Once you have the Ran, life is good. You can just give kinyanim, you can just give presents on Shabbos, whatever you want, however you want. Not however. Whatever you want, just not however you want. That's all, right? So that's how he starts off. So why do we need the Mordechai? He says it could be that here too you need the heter of Mishum Mitzvah. Now, it sounded to me more like the Beit Yosef says, well, if Shah, meaning I need to explain the Mordechai somehow, so whatever. But really, his leaning is more towards the Kula and the Ran and the Meiri. The Bach and the Magen Avraham seem to understand The Bach and the Magen Avraham seem to understand more like the more machmir way, right? It says you need the Mordechai and the Ran together, right? After I have a Heter Mishum Mitzvah, then I can also do it. Then I still have to do it. Sorry, b'Meshicha b'lo kiyan suda. But any other present, obviously, I can't. Do you see the point there? Beit Meir is more Mekel. Haran al kochenu v'chalek b'ntiat mashkon da'avid b'chlal gzirat mekach u'memkar v'netna b'Meshicha b'lo kiyan suda. Devadai shari. So generally speaking, matana b'lo kiyan suda mutar. Period. That's it. Shma mina shein b'ntinat matnat metaltelin b'Meshicha gzirat mekach u'memkar. Right? That's the one you were looking for, right? There's just no such isur. There's no problem with just giving someone a present by hand on Shabbos or Yom Tov. He says, and then he goes even farther and says, "Efshar molchei la'anut dati model laran, afilu molchei la'anut dati model laran." Sorry, right? I actually think the ela shekatav l'rav chadamilta. Look, it's going to be hard for people to accept this, so we'll say it's a mitzvah. But really, the Mordechai doesn't really need that. Really would work also without the mitzvah. Now, tough, he realizes it's hard to accept that because the Mordechai did say what he said. So he ends up saying, even if you'll argue that the Mordechai disagrees, the Ran is right, and the Ran is right in the more mekel way. So, just to sum this point up, this Ran says that when you give a present, it has to be done below sudar, without a sudar, you have to do low-key, low-level kinyan. There are two ways of reading the Ran. One way is to say, to connect him to the Mordechai, and one way is to say that he's arguing with the Mordechai. Agreeing with the Mordechai, you say, this case, which is a special heter mishum mitzvah, you also have to do it in a special way below sudar. And then we have three categories, right? You have the category of things you should be sending, presents you should be sending on Shabbos Yom Tov, and that you could just do anything you want. Then there's special kulot, like this one, mishum mitzvah, it's a special heter. Because the special heter will do without a kiyan sudar. And the lowest level, that things that you can't really justify, you're not allowed to give at all, not even in this way. The other way of reading the Ran is more like the way the Beit Yosef starts up here, that presumably anything, he means to say there's no justification to giving the present here. The only justification is only giving it by hand. That's what the Meiri seems to say. As we said, the Bach and Magen Avraham seem to take the more machmer approach and connect and say, even after we have a special heter, we have a special kula, still you have to do it not in the normal way of kinyan, as opposed to the Beit Meir who says, no, according to the Ran, you're allowed to give a hand presents over on Shabbos and Yom Tov freely, as long as you're only handing them over, not doing a special kinyan.